Hello and welcome to another lesson in Ivy history. Today we're going to continue talking about the Cold War. Issues with Germany at the hands of the Grand Alliance broke it apart. Neither the Western powers nor the USSR could agree on joint measures for the economic and political reconstruction of this country. So today we're going to be following from wartime allies to war enemies from 1945 to 1947. To begin with, we're going to be talking about the transition from war to fragile peace from 1945 to 1946. Our guiding question is, in what ways did the friction between the members of the Grand Alliance increase during 1945 and 1946? Please take a picture of this diagram or write it in your notes because this is how this presentation is structured. Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, and was replaced by Harry Truman. The new president, like his predecessor, wanted the USSR to declare war against Japan, which would potentially save the US hundreds of thousands of casualties if it became necessary to invade Japan. When the Soviets pressured Poland, the US curtailed their Lend-Lease shipments to the USSR. The US Lend-Lease program began in March 1941 and gave over $50 billion of war supplies to allied nations. This is around $650 billion in today's terms. Stalin, in turn, raised attention since he became suspicious of the US economic strategy. The representatives of Britain, the US, the USSR, and China met at Dumbarton Oaks near Washington to discuss the future structure of the United Nations. They agreed on the establishment of the General Assembly of the United Nations, in which all member nations would be represented, and on the Security Council. Britain, the US, the USSR, and China would be permanent members of this, with the right to veto. Any decision decided upon the Assembly was basically at the hands of these four countries. In 1945, it was decided that France, too, should become a permanent member on the Security Council as well. The atomic bomb was tested successfully at Alamogordo in New Mexico in the United States on the 16th of July of 1945. Its destructive potential was much greater than expected, and it was ready for immediate use against Japanese cities. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, killing nearly half of the population and flattening the city. 3 days later, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing a further 40,000 people. The horrific destruction of these two cities, as well as the massive invasion of Manchuria by the Soviet Union, left Japan with little option but to surrender. While the UN requested control of all nuclear bombs, the US sought to create a monopoly. The latter became a priority when the Soviet espionage network was discovered in November 1945, which operated both in Canada and the US and had already sent much nuclear information to the USSR. Truman therefore agreed in principle to the international control of atomic energy by the United Nations, providing that other nations also agreed to abide by its rules. In November 1945, the US, together with the two nations that had helped it develop the atomic bomb, Britain and Canada, called for the creation of a United Nations Commission, which would create rules for the control of nuclear weapons. These were the exchange of basic scientific information for peaceful ends between all nations, establishing means for the control of atomic energy to ensure its use for peaceful purposes, the elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons, establishing an effective system of inspection to prevent the clandestine manufacture of nuclear bombs. At the Moscow Conference of Foreign Ministers in December 1945, the Soviets agreed to the establishment of the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission. Bureaucratic challenges posed by both the US and the USSR made it unclear as to what the future of nuclear power would be. While Britain, the US, and the USSR could agree on the necessary measures for German demilitarization, denazification, and the punishment of war criminals, they were only able to conclude the following minimal political and economic guidelines for the future of Germany. As there was no central German control, an Allied Control Council, ACC, was established, composed of the military commanders from each of the four occupying powers. Each country, however, would have a commander rule over their own zones. Agreements on reparations was difficult to achieve. The USSR had suffered immense damage in the war and was determined to extract as much as possible in reparations from Germany. Britain and the US, on the other hand, were convinced that the German economy must be left sufficiently strong so that it could pay for the imported food and raw materials that Germans needed. Ultimately, each zone would take reparations accordingly. The Western Allies had agreed at Yalta Poland should be awarded substantial accessions of territory from Germany to compensate for the land annexed by the USSR. In turn, Stalin did not care whatsoever and established his own borders. At Potsdam, the Council of Ministers, composed of the foreign ministers of Britain, the USSR, China, France, and the US, was formed to negotiate peace treaties with the former Axis powers of Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland, Hungary, and to prepare a peace settlement with Germany once the Allies had set up a German government able to negotiate on their behalf. Treaties with Italy and the minor Axis powers from 1945 to 1947 were kind of contentious in the international state of affairs. The Council of Ministers could not reach consensus. To save the negotiations from a complete breakdown, James Burns, the US Secretary of State, went to Moscow in December 1945, where a compromise was reached whereby the Eastern European and the Italian peace treaties would be negotiated simultaneously. In the end, most peace treaties concluded with compromises. On the Italian side, only by agreeing to a severe peace with Italy, which involved the loss of territory to Yugoslavia, the payment of 360 million reparations, and control on the size of Italy's armed forces, was the US able to achieve agreement that Italy's former colonies would become trusteeships under the United Nations. With the signature of the treaty, Italy again became an independent state. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets wanted the conclusion of the peace treaties with the former Axis states as soon as possible, as they wished to dissolve the Allied Control Commissions on which Western observers participated and obtained reparations. So basically, we see the creation of these two fronts and all these issues that are going to be pertaining to the independence of these newly created countries, to the demilitarization of some areas of Europe, and also to the liberation of some countries that have been taken over by Nazi Germany or by other military rules like the one in Italy. So here is the Treaty of Peace with Italy, signed at Paris on February 10, 1947. This is how this treaty ends with the taking over of the United States, Great Britain, France, and the USSR as major component in the creation of a new government, and we're going to be seeing how that plays out later on. Now we're going to move on to the second section of this presentation, Germany, from June 1945 to April 1947. Our key question for this section is, why did the four occupying powers fail to work out a joint program for Germany's future? We're going to be seeing how it all split up and how it didn't really work out in the way that people cooperated and collaborated with each other. Please take a picture of this diagram or write it in your notes. This is how we're going to be building this section of the presentation. Germany's potential wealth and military and economic strength ensured that neither the USSR nor the Western Allies would allow the other to dominate it. Indeed, as tension rose, both sides began to wonder whether Germany itself could be rehabilitated to become an ally in a future conflict between the two. The German question became one of the central issues of the Cold War. In June 1945, Stalin explained his plans for eventually bringing a reunified Germany into the Moscow sphere of influence to the leaders of the German Communist Party, the KPD. The Red Army would directly control the Soviet zone of occupation, while the KPD would seek to win the support of the German workers in both the Soviet and the Western zones. When elections would be held, then the KVP could gain control. This may as well have been the reason why the USSR was the first occupying power to allow the formation of democratic parties in its zone in June 1945. To broaden the appeal of the KPD, Stalin ordered his officials to force the merger of the Socialist Democratic Party, the SPD, with the KPD in the Soviet zone in Eastern Germany, even though 20,000 Social Democrats had been imprisoned or worse. So we have the creation of this Socialist Unity Party, the SED, with a coalition of the two parties. So in terms of the reaction in Western Germany, the violence in Eastern Germany created fear and suspicion in Western Germany, preventing the party's successes there. When SPD voters in the western zones of Berlin were asked by the SPD leaders in Berlin to approve the merger of the two parties, it was rejected by 82%. The problem of reparations was key to this conflict. By the spring of 1946, the compromise over reparations, which had been negotiated in Potsdam, was already breaking down. With all the Polish and Czech refugees, there were too many mouths to feed in British and American zones. Britain and the US wanted a moderate German economy to recover that economic and allow them to grow, so that their zones could at least pay for their own food imports. They might even have to ask for help from the Soviet East. General Clay, governor of the US occupied zone, attempted to force the Soviets to agree to British and US economic policy in Germany by unilaterally announcing in May 1946 that no further deliveries of reparation goods would be made to the Soviet Union. In response, the Soviets saw this as an attempt by the US to force Germany's reconstruction along capitalist lines, which would benefit both US and British industries as it would inevitably integrate Germany into their trading systems. The Soviets responded in June 1946 by increasing Eastern Germany's industrial production, the products of which went directly to the Soviet Union as reparations, while taking over 213 East German companies. Later, in the Conference of Foreign Ministers, no consensus was reached yet again. So again, in terms of reparations, people are fighting each other, so we have to be careful of who gets what in Germany when we're moving forward with the decision-making of these four countries that are involved. Because of this, we have the creation of Estonia in January 1947. This lack of agreement was a major step in the division of Germany into two states, which eventually took place in 1949. When the British and the US zones were merged economically in 1947 to form what became known as Estonia, the US argued that far from breaking the Potsdam Agreement, the amalgamation would eventually create the economic conditions for fulfilling the Potsdam Agreement and enabling reparations to be paid. Estonia would be the first stage in restoring economic prosperity to Germany, and this prosperity would mean that the French and Soviet zones would eventually merge with it. The Soviets suspected that Britain and the US hoped to use Estonia only to create a capitalist Germany, and then believed that the two countries did not have the right to form such an economic entity by themselves without consulting the USSR or France. In the Moscow Conference of 1947, it was basically a turning point in early post-war history. The Soviets made a determined effort to destroy Estonia by demanding that a new Central German administration under four-power control should be immediately created, in line with earlier agreements that all four powers should rule Germany together. The lack of unity at the Moscow Conference on the part of the four powers regarding Germany's economic future gave Britain and the US an excuse to continue operating independently in their zones with little regard for Soviet views. Now for section 3 of this presentation, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Our guiding question is, to what extent was the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan designed to contain Soviet power? Take a screenshot of this diagram, write it in your notes. This is how this presentation is going to be structured. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan marked the real beginning of the Cold War and of U.S. military and economic engagement in Western Europe. Together, they helped ensure capitalist and democratic governments in much of Western and Southern Europe, while limiting the political and economic influence of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. In June 1945, the U.S. assumed that Britain would continue to play a major role in the Eastern Mediterranean, but Britain faced a crippling economic crisis. In 1947, Britain informed the U.S. that its financial and military aid to both Greece and Turkey would cease on March 31st as a result of financial problems. The U.S. meanwhile faced deteriorating relations with the Soviet Union over Germany, while in 1946 the Soviets had put military and political pressure on Turkey and Iran. A communist-led rebellion, not directly assisted by the USSR, was also threatening the pro-Western government in Greece. Early in 1942, Britain and the Soviet Union moved troops into Iran to safeguard its oil supplies from threats from Italy and Germany, and agreed to remove their troops 6 months after the end of hostilities. At war's end, however, the Soviets increased their troops number in Iran. This was seen as a threat to both neighboring Turkey and Iraq. The US protested against Soviet moves, and Iran appealed to the Security Council of the United Nations in order to have the Soviets withdraw their forces. This was accomplished in March 1946. In August 1946, a new crisis arose when the Soviets suggested a plan for a joint Turkish-Soviet defense of the Dardanelles, a strait connecting the Mediterranean and Aegean seas with the Black Sea, separating Europe from Asia Minor. The US suspected that this was an attempt by the Soviets to establish naval bases in Turkey and make it a Soviet satellite state. In response, the US government encouraged Turkey to resist Soviet demands and dispatched units of the US naval fleet to the Mediterranean in a demonstration of military might. The Soviets dropped their demands on Turkey. In Greece, Stalin proceeded with caution as he had agreed with Churchill in 1944 that the country was in Britain's sphere of interest. The Soviets gave little direct aid to the communist guerrillas who were fighting a civil war there. Instead, Stalin allowed Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Albania to assist the Greek Communist Party with both soldiers and money in the campaign against the British-backed Greek government. Truman regarded the rebels as an instrument of Soviet policy and feared that their successes in Greece would lead to a domino effect that would force Turkey and other countries in the region into their Soviet sphere of influence. This domino effect is a key belief during the Cold War. This belief is that the fall of one state to communism would result in a chain reaction leading to the fall of other neighboring states. Truman felt that he had to act quickly to strengthen non-communist forces in areas that were vulnerable to Soviet pressure. On March 12th, Truman appealed to Congress by outlining his views on the state of international politics, highlighting the increasing divide between the US and the Soviet Union. He outlined plans for financially assisting states like Greece and Turkey, which were perceived to be threatened by communism. It was soon clear, however, that this was the beginning of a new US policy, which was rapidly supplemented by substantial economic aid through the Marshall Plan. Since 1945, the US had granted funds to governments in Western Europe to prevent economic collapse and starvation. In June 1947, US Secretary of State George Marshall made his economic offer of aid for Europe. The key to it was that Europeans must help themselves while the US would provide the money. The Europeans were to set a supranational organization that would plan how US aid should be spent. After Marshall's speech, the British and French called for a conference in Paris to formulate plans for the acceptance of US aid. Stalin suspected that the Marshall Plan masked an attempt by the US to interfere in the domestic affairs of the European states, but he sent Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov to Paris to discuss further details with Britain and France. The Soviets certainly wanted financial aid from the US, but without any conditions attached. It was agreed, however, that a joint program would be required for aid to be received. Molotov rejected this and left to the Paris talks, as Stalin feared that an economic program involving cooperation with these Western European nations would enable US economic power to undermine Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. So here's a graph showing how much Marshall aid was given to each Western European country, including the Federal Republic of Germany, which was formed by the Western Allies in 1949. Obviously, there's millions of dollars put into Western Europe in order to prevent the spread of communism. Detailed negotiations on the Marshall Plan began at the Conference of European Economic Cooperation, where 16 Western European nations, including Turkey and Greece, were represented. Stalin prevented Eastern European countries from attending. France was, however, ready to consider the formation of a European customs union or free trade area as long as it enabled France to control the Western German economy. Britain wished to safeguard its national sovereignty and was opposed to creating powerful supranational organizations. However, each country had a list of requests. The only advancements were the following: 17 states agreeing to allow imports from countries involved in the Marshall Plan, all agreeing that Germany needed to recover economically while also still being controlled, all agreeing to develop hydroelectric power together and to facilitate cross-frontier railway freight, all agreeing to establish overall production targets for coal, oil, and steel, and also agricultural products. To fulfill these first steps, in 1948, the U.S. Congress approved a program for $5 billion as the first installment of the Marshall Plan aid. To administer and distribute this, the Organization for Economic European Cooperation was created. It's called the OEEC. Although each nation involved did not surrender any of its authority to the OEEC, it was key for the implementation of this program nevertheless. The image on the left is basically the image that represents those 16 countries involved. Now moving on to the fourth section of our presentation, the Iron Curtain. Our guiding question is, how far had an Iron Curtain descended across Europe by the end of 1947? Stalin's decision to pressure Eastern European states to boycott the talks on the Marshall Plan in Paris marked the end of his attempts to cooperate with the US and maintain the Grand Alliance. In September 1947, he invited the leaders of Eastern Europe and the leaders of the French and Italian Communist parties to a conference in Poland to discuss establishing the Communist Information Bureau, or Cominform. This organization would coordinate policies and tactics of communist parties in both the satellite states and in Western Europe. Andrei Zdanov, chairman of the Soviet Union, told the delegates that the world was now divided into two hostile camps. The imperialist bloc, led by the US, intent on the economic enslavement of Europe, and the anti-imperialist and democratic camp, led by the USSR. Please note the use of words democratic in both spheres of influence. So here is a major speech by Winston Churchill in which he explains this concept of the Iron Curtain. I'm going to read it to you. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia, all these famous cities and the populations around them lie in the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high, increasing measure of control from Moscow. Here is the creation of the Eastern Bloc. In both Italy and France, there were strong communist parties, which, as in the Eastern European states, had been members of coalition governments. Cominform instructed them that they were to oppose their country's support for the Marshall Plan. However, the composition of the newly created governments in both countries did not allow for any communist success. By the end of 1947, Eastern Europe, with the exception of Finland, had fallen under Soviet control. the US and Britain were not ready to risk the outbreak of war with the USSR by intervening directly in the affairs of Eastern Europe. Their priority was to prevent the spread of communism to Western Europe. To deflect Western criticism from his policies in Poland, Stalin followed the Yalta Agreement and established a provisional government of national unity in June 1945 to govern until elections could be held. Poland's national election, held on the 19th of January 1945, took place in an atmosphere of fear and intimidation, with 2 million potentially anti-communist voters struck from voter rolls by the provisional government. Voters were pressured to vote for approved candidates only. Officially, 80.1% voted for the pro-Soviet Democratic Bloc, while the anti-Soviet Peasants' Party won only 6.9%. Britain and the US complained about the lack of free elections, but eventually accepted the results as they had no means by which to force the Soviets to change their policy or actions in Poland. In fact, the new doctrine of containment, being formulated by Truman, accepted unofficially that Poland was within the USSR's spheres of interest, and the US would not intervene in its domestic affairs. This doctrine of containment is another key ideological policy in the Cold War. It's a policy of halting the USSR's advance into Western Europe. It did not envisage, however, removing Soviet control of Eastern Europe. In Romania, we have the USSR intervening as well. Like Poland, Romania was a vital security zone for the USSR, protecting it from attack on its southwest border, while it also possessed valuable oil supplies. In March 1945, the Soviet chairman of the Allied Control Commission, with the support of the Red Army, ordered the king to dismiss his government and appoint a National Front Democratic government, which contained a socialist, communist, liberal representative who were ready to cooperate with them, under the leadership of Petru Groza. The communists had control over the working of the government themselves. After the Potsdam Conference, at which it was decided that peace treaties could only be signed with when governments recognized by the wartime allies had been established, Romania's King Michael called on Britain and the US not to recognize a new government as it was imposed by the Soviet Union. However, with the merging of the socialist and the communist parties, the government could not be changed. In November 1946, the communist-dominated fronts went to the polls. As in Poland, abuses did not occur during the election. Opposition newspapers were closed down, leading members of the opposition were murdered. It was therefore unsurprising that the front won more than 80% of the vote. People were scared to vote for any opposition to the Soviets. Most of the population did not support the Soviet influence due to the redistribution of land. Romania refused martial aid and joined the Cominform. In December 1947, the king was forced to abdicate, and in April 1948, a communist people republic was declared. So again, with the intervention of the communist parties within the government, they're able to take over. In Bulgaria, a similar thing happens. The Soviets applied similar techniques and policies to those used in Romania, although Stalin hoped to avoid unnecessary friction with the Western powers until a peace treaty was signed. In December 1945, the Bulgarian government, which was dominated by the Communist Party, was forced by the Soviets to include 2 members of the opposition, although they were given no real power. The Bulgarian Communist Party was also ordered to allow the creation of a new Labour Party in September 1946, which would have a broader appeal to the public. In October 1946, elections took place for a National Assembly. Opposition parties managed to win 1/3 of the total votes. While Western hopes were still up, Stalin allowed the Communist Party to remove its opponents. Nikola Petkov, the leader of the Popular Agrarian Party, was executed, and in April 1947, all opposition parties were outlawed. Soon, agriculture was collectivized, and all industries were nationalized. Thus, Bulgaria became a communist state. Yugoslavia occupied a unique position among the Soviet-dominated states in Eastern and Southern Eastern Europe, as its Communist Party had effectively won power independently of the Red Army. The People's Front, a bloc of parties dominated by the Yugoslav Communist Party, won 90% of the votes in November 1945. Tito, Yugoslavia's communist leader, restricted the activity of political parties outside this alliance. The USSR broadly supported Tito and argued that the Trieste in Italy belonged historically as well as geographically and economically to the regions that now formed Yugoslavia, but Stalin was not ready to risk confrontation with Britain and the US over these claims. In the end, an agreement was reached in the Paris peace negotiations in 1947, where the Trieste region was divided into two separate parts, one under Anglo-American control and one under Yugoslav control. In Czechoslovakia, Soviet troops were withdrawn by December 1945. The elections in May 1946, in which communists won 38% of the vote, occurred without any violence or attempt to manipulate the vote, and the coalition government under President Benes remained in power. The Czechoslovak cabinet voted unanimously in July 1947 to send representatives to attend the Paris Conference on the Marshall Plan, but were soon dissuaded by the Soviets from doing so. In February 1948, the Communist Party seized power in Czechoslovakia. And again, by taking control of the government through the Communist Party, they're taking control of the entire state. Hungary, like Czechoslovakia, was treated as a special case by Stalin. The elections of November 1945 were free and transparent. 2 years later, the press was still free, as were debates in parliament, the borders with Austria were open, and smaller businesses were privately owned. The Soviets, however, retained control of the Allied Control Commission. Stalin was able to insist on the Communist Party participating in a coalition government and having authority over the vital Ministry of the Interior, which controlled the nation's security forces. In March 1948, as a result of Soviet pressure, the Hungarian Communist and Socialist parties merged. The following February, the communist-dominated Hungarian People's Independence Front was formed, and in the elections of May 1949, only candidates from the Independence Front, the Communist Party, were allowed to stand. Finland still remained the exception to the pattern developing in other Eastern European states. Its government was headed by a conservative politician and supported by the Democratic Bloc, a coalition composed of the Communist and Social Democrats and their agrarian parties. Historians argue that Stalin simply wanted to neutralize Finland, and once a peace treaty with Finland was concluded in 1947, which committed Finland to paying 300 million in reparation and ceding the strategically important naval base of Pestamo to the USSR, he was ready to leave them alone. He was convinced that, unlike Poland, Finland was no threat to the USSR, and the threat of invasion through Finland into the Soviet Union was considered highly unlikely. Finland declined the invitation to the Paris Conference for the Marshall Plan to remain politically uninvolved. Now, for the last section of this presentation, did the US or the USSR start the Cold War from 1945 to 1947? We're going to be looking at three different perspectives. The first one is traditionalist interpretations. Traditionalist Western historians, such as Herbert Weiss, who wrote in the 1950s, firmly put the blame for starting the Cold War on Stalin. These historians argue that Stalin ignored the promises given at the Yalta Conference in February 1945 to support democratic elected governments altogether. The US, on the other hand, was key in the creation of Estonia, the Truman Doctrine of Containment, and the Marshall Plan to set the clock ticking. Revisionist historians argue that the USA persuaded policies that caused the Cold War in Europe. For instance, William Appleman claimed in 1959 that the US aimed to force the USSR to join the global economy and open its frontiers to both US imports and political ideas, which would have undermined Stalin's government. Post-revisionist historians have the advantage of being able to use Soviet archive material. Historians like John Lewis, Vladislav Subok, and Konstantin Pleshakov have shown that local communists in the Soviet zone in Eastern Germany, Bulgaria, Romania, and elsewhere have had considerable influence on policies which sometimes ran counter to Stalin's own intentions. They have also shown that Stalin's policy in Eastern Europe was more subtle than traditionally viewed. The cases for Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Finland speak for themselves in terms that Stanley was subtly trying to infiltrate the government, but he was not pressured into actually going to war with the other members of the Grand Alliance. So thank you so much to David Williamson for his content, and we recognize the authors of all visual and auditory content in this presentation as well. Thank you.